Think about the way your surname sounds when you say it out loud. Not what it means, not where you've always been told it comes from, just the shape of it in your mouth. If it ends in ton or ham or lay, if it's a trade word like Smith or Baker or Wright, if it carries a son onto the end of an ordinary first name, you may be carrying something older than you think. Older than the family stories about a duke or a knight who supposedly crossed the Channel with William the Conqueror. Older, in some cases, than England itself, as anyone alive today would recognize it. Roughly 36 million Americans reported English ancestry in the most recent census figures, more than any single heritage group besides German, and most of that ancestry traces back to a population that existed in England before the year 1066, before Norman French became the language of the court, before the word England had even settled into its final form. That population is the Anglo-Saxons, and their bloodline did not vanish. It went quiet. It changed its accent, dropped its old names into the bottom drawer of the historical record, and let a French-speaking aristocracy take the credit for the next 1,000 years. If you want to know whether you carry it, you have to know what to look for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Start with who the Anglo-Saxons actually were, because the name hides 3 separate groups. The Angles came from a peninsula called Anglon in what is now the border country between Germany and Denmark. The Saxons came from the region the Romans called Saxonia, along the North Sea coast of what is now Lower Saxony in Germany. The Jutes, the smallest and least documented of the 3, are usually placed in Jutland, the mainland of modern Denmark. Beginning in the 5th century, after Roman authority had withdrawn from Britain and the Romano-British population was left to defend itself against Pictish and Irish raiders, these 3 Germanic-speaking peoples began crossing the North Sea in numbers large enough to change the language, the law, and eventually the genetic makeup of lowland Britain. The process was not a single invasion. It stretched across 2 centuries, with new arrivals settling among, intermarrying with, and in places displacing the existing Romano-British population, who spoke a Brittonic Celtic language and had lived under 4 centuries of Roman rule. By the 7th century, the newcomers had organized themselves into a patchwork of small kingdoms that historians later grouped under the name the Heptarchy: Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, along with the smaller kingdoms of Kent, Essex, and Sussex. These kingdoms fought each other, merged, and fractured for 300 years, developing their own dialects of what we now call Old English, their own law codes, and their own royal lines. Wessex eventually absorbed most of the others, especially after King Alfred the Great held the line against a Danish Viking invasion in the late 9th century, and his successors built the fractured kingdoms into a single English crown. That kingdom lasted until 1066, when Duke William of Normandy crossed the Channel, defeated King Harold Godwinson at Hastings, and placed a French-speaking Norman aristocracy over an English-speaking Anglo-Saxon population that outnumbered its new rulers by a wide margin. The vernacular record the Anglo-Saxons left behind, a set of annals known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun under Alfred and copied and continued at monasteries for centuries afterward, kept being written in Old English at Peterborough Abbey until 1154, nearly 100 years after the Conquest, a small, stubborn thread of the old language surviving in ink long after it had lost the throne. Most of what we know about the earliest phase of this migration comes from a monk named Bede, writing at the monastery of Jarrow in the early 700s, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people named the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes specifically and described the kingdoms that grew out of their settlement. Bede wrote in Latin, the scholarly language of the Church, but the people he was describing spoke Old English, a language close enough to modern Dutch and Low German that a 5th century Saxon farmer and a 5th century Frisian farmer could likely have understood each other without much trouble. That language did something the Norman Conquest never managed to undo. It gave modern English almost all of its shortest, most frequently used words: house, water, bread, earth, man, woman, child, love, hate, live, die. Linguists who count word frequency rather than raw vocabulary size have found that Old English words still make up the large majority of everything an English speaker actually says in ordinary conversation, even though the majority of the dictionary's total entries eventually came from French and Latin. The aristocracy changed. The words for beef and pork, borrowed from the French boeuf and pork, to describe the meat once it reached the Norman lord's table, sit right next to the English words cow and pig, still used for the living animal the Anglo-Saxon peasant actually raised. The split in the vocabulary is, in miniature, the same split running through the surnames. That single fact, an occupying elite ruling a much larger native population, explains almost everything about how Anglo-Saxon ancestry hides itself in the historical and genetic record today. The Normans took the land, the titles, and the top layer of the historical narrative. The Anglo-Saxons kept the language, the place names, the trades, and, as it turns out, most of the DNA. The first sign is sitting in your own last name, if it happens to be an English trade word. Smith, meaning a worker in metal, is the most common surname in both England and the United States, and it survived the conquest for a specific reason. Norman French had its own words for nobility, for land tenure, for warfare, but the everyday trades of English village life kept their English names because the people doing that work kept speaking English. Baker, weaver, shepherd, fisher, wright meaning a craftsman or builder, carter, fuller referring to someone who cleaned and thickened woolen cloth, tanner, miller, cook, mason, turner. Every one of these began as an occupational description attached to an ordinary Anglo-Saxon villager, not a Norman lord, because the Norman lord did not personally card wool or shoe horses. Even a name like reeve or bailiff, which sound official, describe a local Anglo-Saxon manor administrator, a position that existed under English custom before the conquest and simply kept its English title afterward. When English surnames finally began to solidify into hereditary family names between the 12th and 14th centuries, a process pushed along by the need for tax and legal records, these occupational names locked in at the bottom of the social order among the people who had never stopped being Anglo-Saxon in language and in most cases in blood. Contrast that with the surnames that came over with the conquest. Norman names tended to attach themselves to places in Normandy itself, carried across the Channel by the D prefix that marked landholding French nobility, de Montfort, de Clare, de Vere, de Varennes. Those names marked the ruling class, and they show up disproportionately in the small handful of families later genealogists could actually trace back to the Battle of Hastings roll. Even where a Norman name eventually lost its day and settled into a plainer English spelling, Percy, Beaumont, Gournay, it usually kept some trace of its French origin in the way it sounds against an English ear, a softness or a syllable pattern that the blunt, consonant-heavy trade names never had. If your family surname is a plain English trade word with no French residue in its spelling or structure, the odds are good that somewhere in the chain of people who carried it, you are looking at the conquered population rather than the conquerors. The second sign is a name that ends in son, attached to an ordinary English first name. Johnson, Wilson, Robertson, Richardson, Harrison, Stevenson, Edwards, in its older possessive form. The pattern is a patronymic, a surname built directly from the father's given name, and it is one of the oldest naming conventions in the Germanic-speaking world, older than the idea of a fixed family surname at all. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England carried exactly this kind of name. Harold Godwinson, killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, was literally Harold, son of Godwin, his father's name preserved directly in his own. After the conquest, that naming habit did not disappear from English villages even as the aristocracy above them spoke French. It kept being used by ordinary families for centuries, eventually crystallizing into the fixed hereditary surnames that walked onto the immigrant ships bound for America. Names built the same way, but never fixed into hereditary surnames, also survive in family Bibles and parish registers as a middle step. A father's given name recorded alongside a son's as son of, in Latin, Church Latin, filius, before English clerks finally started writing the vernacular son, ending directly onto the page sometime in the 13 and 1400s. There is a complication worth naming honestly. The son pattern is not exclusively Anglo-Saxon. It is also the standard patronymic form in Old Norse, carried into England by Danish and Norwegian settlers who occupied large parts of northern and eastern England during the 9th and 10th centuries, in the territory that came to be called the Danelaw. A surname like Thorson or Ericsson leans Scandinavian. A surname built on an Old English personal name, Edward, Alfred, Osborne, Wilfred, Godwin itself, leans Anglo-Saxon. Either way, if your surname is a patronymic built on a Germanic first name rather than a French or Latin one, you are looking at pre-conquest English or Scandinavian ancestry, not the Norman layer that sits on top of the history books. The third sign involves the second most common category of English surname, the ones built from a place. Old English placed a small set of suffixes onto the end of a settlement name depending on what kind of place it was. Tun, from the Old English tun, meant an enclosed farmstead or homestead, and it shows up in surnames like Sutton, Hamilton, Compton, and Preston. Ham meant a home or village, giving names like Buckingham, Wyndham, and Cunningham. Lee, from Leah, described a woodland clearing, producing Ashley, Bradley, and Hadley. Field, Worth, meaning an enclosure, stead, meaning a place or site, and bury, from the Old English bur, meaning a fortified settlement, follow the same pattern. Someone in your family tree once lived at, or came from, a specific small Anglo-Saxon settlement, and their neighbors started calling them by that place until it stopped being a description and became a name. Norman toponymic surnames read differently on the page. They tend to preserve the French day construction, or they name a Norman town outright, Percy, from the village of Percy in Normandy. Beaumont, meaning literally beautiful hill in French. Mortimer, from Mortimer. When a surname names an English village using an Old English geographic suffix, the family it names was rooted in that English soil before a Norman ever set foot on it. When a surname names a French town or uses the French day, the family it names arrived with the conquest, or claimed to. There is a third category worth knowing, because it trips up more people than either of the first two. A surname that looks aristocratic on the surface, church, priest, bishop, abbot, monk, is not Norman at all. These names describe an ordinary English villager's relationship to the local church, rather than a rank of nobility, someone who worked church land, played the part of a bishop or an abbot in a village pageant, or simply lived near the churchyard. Old English place elements also survive in surnames that no longer look like place names to a modern reader, worn down by centuries of casual pronunciation. Studying the actual root rather than the modern spelling is usually the only way to tell the difference, which is one reason a proper etymological surname dictionary is worth more than a guess based on how a name sounds today. The fourth sign lives inside a DNA test, and it takes a little more explaining than a surname does. In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Stephen Leslie published a study in the journal Nature called The Fine-Scale Genetic Structure of the British Population, built on data from the People of the British Isles project, which had collected DNA from thousands of British residents whose grandparents were all born in the same small area. That last detail mattered more than it sounds. By sampling people whose 4 grandparents came from the same tight cluster of parishes, the researchers filtered out the 20th century's internal migration and reconstructed something close to a genetic snapshot of England before the railways, before the industrial cities pulled people away from their home counties. What came out of that snapshot surprised even the researchers who ran it. The study found that the population of England is not genetically uniform. It clusters into distinct regional groups, and the clustering lines up remarkably well with the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the boundaries of the historic Celtic-speaking regions. Populations in Wales and Cornwall, the parts of Britain that resisted or were pushed beyond the reach of Anglo-Saxon settlement, showed the least genetic contribution from continental northern Europe and the strongest continuity with the pre-Anglo-Saxon Romano-British population. Populations in the east and south of England, the historic core of Wessex, East Anglia, and Kent, showed a meaningfully higher share of ancestry connected to the migration-era settlers from the Anglo and Saxon homelands, estimated by later analysis of the same dataset at somewhere between roughly 1 in 10 and 2 in 5 of a given person's ancestry, depending on the specific region. A separate line of evidence comes directly from bone rather than from living blood. In 2016, a team led by Stefan Schiffels published ancient DNA results in Nature Communications, drawn from early Anglo-Saxon-era burial sites in Cambridgeshire, in eastern England, including cemeteries at Oakington and Hingston. The skeletons buried there, dated to the 5th through 7th centuries, carried ancestry closely matching modern Dutch and Danish populations, genetically distinct from the Romano-British remains buried in the same region only a few generations earlier. The ancient DNA confirmed what the surname evidence had only implied. A real population, not just a change of fashion or language, moved into eastern Britain in this period and stayed. Y chromosome studies of modern England add one more thread. Haplogroup I1, a paternal lineage most common today in Scandinavia and northern Germany, appears at elevated frequency in eastern and southern England compared with Wales and the far southwest, sitting alongside the far more common Western European haplogroup R1b as a secondary marker of the Germanic migration. If a commercial DNA test returns a result heavy on England and northwestern Europe, with a secondary signal touching Germanic Europe, specifically the Netherlands, northern Germany, or Denmark, that combination sits closer to the actual genetic signature of Anglo-Saxon migration than a broad British Isles category alone would suggest. The fifth sign is geographic, and it depends on knowing which part of England your family actually left. If the parish records point to Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent, Sussex, or the old heartland of Wessex running through Hampshire, Wiltshire, and Dorset, your family comes from the historic center of Anglo-Saxon settlement and rule, the ground the Heptarchy kingdoms were built on. If the records point further north and east, to Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, or the East Midlands, the Anglo-Saxon layer is still there, but it sits underneath a second wave of Scandinavian settlement. That region was called the Danelaw, after the Viking army that occupied it in the 9th century, and it stayed under Scandinavian law and custom for generations before being reabsorbed into a unified English kingdom. A family from the Danelaw is often carrying an Anglo-Saxon base overlaid with a Norse addition, which shows up in local place names that end in by, meaning farmstead in Old Norse, rather than the Anglo-Saxon tun or ham. Towns like Whitby, Derby, and Grimsby carry that Norse ending directly, sitting inside a county that was Anglo-Saxon territory before the Viking army arrived and remained majority Anglo-Saxon in population even after the Norse settlers moved in on top of it. If the records instead point to Wales, Cornwall, or the far southwest, the Anglo-Saxon signal thins out considerably, because those were the regions the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms never fully absorbed, and the surviving Brittonic place names and the modern Welsh and Cornish languages are the clearest evidence of a population that kept its pre-Anglo-Saxon identity largely intact. None of these signs work in isolation. A surname alone can mislead, a DNA percentage alone can flatten centuries of history into a pie chart, but layered together, the trade name, the -son ending, the place name suffix, the DNA match to the Anglo-Saxon homelands, and the county of origin start to draw an outline of a family that has been in the English record for far longer than the family stories admit. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The sixth sign is a document that is nearly 1,000 years old and still searchable today. In 1086, 20 years after the conquest, William the Conqueror ordered a full survey of his new kingdom, recording who held every parcel of land, what it was worth, and who had held it before 1066, under the last Anglo-Saxon kings. The result, known as the Domesday Book, is one of the earliest and most complete administrative records in European history, and it names thousands of English settlements that already existed, with their Anglo-Saxon names already fixed, before the Norman aristocracy took over. If the parish or village your family's surname or family history points back to appears in the Domesday Book under substantially the same name it carries today, that settlement was already Old English ground when William's clerks rode through recording it. The book is digitized and searchable through the National Archives of the United Kingdom and through several university projects, and it records not just the settlement's name, but its population, its plow teams, its mills, and its recorded value both before and after the conquest, a level of administrative detail that would not be matched again in English record-keeping for centuries. Finding your ancestral village listed there with its Old English name intact is about as close to primary source confirmation as genealogy in this period gets. The seventh sign is the migration pattern that actually brought the ancestry to America, and it was mapped in detail by the historian David Hackett Fisher in his 1989 study Albion's Seed. Fisher spent years working through passenger lists, parish records, probate inventories, and local dialect studies to argue that American regional culture, its speech patterns, its building styles, its attitudes toward family and authority, did not spring up independently on this side of the Atlantic. It was carried over largely intact from 4 specific folk cultures in the English regions the colonists actually left, and it kept reproducing itself for generations after the ships stopped running. Fisher traced 4 distinct waves of English colonial migration, each pulled from a different region of England, each carrying a different dialect and a different set of customs, and, though DNA testing did not exist when he wrote, a different depth of Anglo-Saxon versus later admixture. The first wave, the Puritan migration to New England between 1629 and 1640, drew heavily from East Anglia, the same Norfolk and Suffolk countryside that sits at the historic center of Anglo-Saxon settlement and carries, according to the later genetic studies, some of the highest Anglo-Saxon ancestry signal in England. The second wave, indentured servants and younger sons of the gentry bound for Virginia between 1642 and 1675, drew from the south and west of England. The third wave, Quakers bound for the Delaware Valley between 1675 and 1725, drew from the North Midlands. The fourth wave, border families bound for the Appalachian backcountry between 1717 and 1775, drew from the Anglo-Scottish border region, a zone with its own distinct and turbulent history, closer to the Scots-Irish story than to the Anglo-Saxon one. The names on those Puritan ships still read like a catalogue of Old English surnames. William Bradford, the second governor of Plymouth Colony, carried a name built from Broad and Ford, describing an ancestor's home near a wide river crossing somewhere in England, generations before he was born. John Winthrop, first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, carried a name genealogists usually trace to Winthorpe, a village whose own name combines an Old English personal name with the Scandinavian Thorpe suffix common in the Old Danelaw, a small reminder that the two layers of ancestry, Anglo-Saxon and Norse, rarely stayed cleanly separated, even 1,000 years later. Neither man's family told stories about Norman knights. Their names told a plainer and, as it turns out, more common story. If your family's colonial arrival traces to early New England, specifically to Massachusetts Bay or Connecticut before 1640, you are looking at the migration stream drawn most directly from the historic Anglo-Saxon heartland of England, transplanted with unusual completeness onto American soil. There is a reason this ancestry reads as background rather than headline, and it goes back further than any American family history. After 1066, the people who controlled the writing of English history for the next several centuries were, for the most part, Norman or French-descended clerics and chroniclers, writing in Latin and French, describing a kingdom in which the Anglo-Saxon population appears mostly as the taxed, the ruled, and the occasionally rebellious. English as a written literary language nearly disappeared from official use for 200 years, surviving in vernacular sermons, wills, and the everyday speech of villages while the court, the law, and the church conducted their business in French and Latin. English historians in the 17th century gave this pattern a name, calling it the Norman yoke, the idea that Anglo-Saxon England had possessed its own laws, its own free institutions, and its own identity, all of it suppressed by conquest and only partially recovered in the centuries since. That framing shaped English political thought for generations, invoked by parliamentarians against the crown in the 1600s and by reformers again in the 1800s. It also shaped which family stories got passed down with pride. A supposed connection to a Norman knight who arrived with William carried social prestige for centuries. A plain descent from an Anglo-Saxon farmer who was already there did not, even though the second story was, for most English families, by far the more likely one. The elite intermarried, kept records, and commissioned genealogies. The peasantry farmed the same land under a new landlord and kept its old names, its old place names, and, it turns out, most of the actual population. None of this means every English-sounding surname in an American family tree is a guaranteed Anglo-Saxon line, and the honest caveats matter as much as the signs themselves. Surnames drift. A family recorded as Smith in one parish register might appear as Smith 2 generations later, with no change in ancestry at all, simply a shift in how the local clerk chose to spell it. Occupational surnames were adopted independently by unrelated families in different villages, so 2 Americans named Baker today may share no common medieval ancestor whatsoever. Commercial DNA ethnicity estimates group England together with parts of northwestern Europe in a single broad category precisely because the underlying populations of Britain and the near continent have been exchanging genes for over 1,000 years, since long before the word Anglo-Saxon existed, which means a high England and northwestern Europe percentage confirms deep roots in the region without, on its own, proving descent from the 5th century migration specifically, rather than from later Norman, Huguenot, or Dutch arrivals layered on top of it. What actually confirms the connection is the layering. A trade or patronymic surname with no French residue, a family origin in the historic Wessex or East Anglian heartland, or, at one remove, the Danelaw, a DNA match weighted toward England alongside the Netherlands, Denmark, or northern Germany, rather than toward France or the Celtic fringe, a village of origin listed in the Domesday Book under its Old English name, and a colonial arrival that traces to the early Puritan migration into New England. Any single one of these is suggestive on its own, easy enough to explain away as coincidence. 3 or 4 together, in the same family line, stop being coincidence and start being a pattern, which is about as close as this kind of ancestry gets to a documented case, in the absence of a written pedigree reaching all the way back to the 11th century. The records to check this against are largely free. English parish registers, which began in 1538 under a decree from Thomas Cromwell, and often survive for individual villages back to that date, are searchable through Family Search and through the county record offices that hold the originals. The Domesday Book itself has been digitized by the National Archives of the United Kingdom, searchable by place name. The people of the British Isles genetic dataset underlying the Leslie study is described in detail in the original Nature paper, freely accessible for anyone who wants to read past the summary rather than take a stranger's word for it. None of it requires a paid subscription or a genealogist's salary to start, only patience, a willingness to read a parish register in someone else's cramped 17th century handwriting, and the understanding that the plainest name in the family tree is usually the one with the longest paper trail behind it, not the shortest. Say your surname out loud again. If it names a trade your ancestor practiced with their hands, or a father whose own name got folded into yours, or a small English farmstead nobody outside a handful of parish clerks would ever have heard of, you are not hearing an accident of pronunciation. You are hearing the residue of a population that watched its kingdom get taken by conquest, kept its language alive in the fields and workshops while French ran the court, and eventually put its names, its place names, and its blood on ships bound for a country that would one day let you search all of it from a laptop at your own kitchen table. The Normans got the chronicles. The Anglo-Saxons got everything else, and it is still there, spelled out in your own name, waiting to be read correctly. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.